Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Pichardo. I'm the Director of Family and Community Engagement for the Providence School Department. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our Parent University session, Real Life, Real Talk, Shame-Free Conversations with Your Children. Buenas tardes a todos nuestros padres en la llamada esta tarde. Bienvenidos a la Universidad para Padres. Mi nombre es Janet Pichardo, Directora de Asuntos Familiares aquí en el distrito. Gracias por asistir a nuestra sesión de esta tarde. Real Life, Real Talk, conversaciones sin vergüenza con sus hijos. Para los padres que están en nuestra llamada, si pueden mirar hacia abajo de su pantalla y busquen el icono que es como un globo, una bolita. Cuando presionan en ese globo, pueden entonces ver una lista de idiomas, en este caso español. Van a ver Spanish para que elijan ese idioma. Cuando le dan clic, van a poder entrar al canal donde van a poder escuchar esta presentación completamente en español. What I just did is that I invited our families who are on the call that need Spanish interpretation and provided some guidance on how to access the interpretation channel. We do have in Spanish interpreters available this evening. So again, thank you so much. We are going to move forward. We have some norms just to provide you an idea on how we move forward with this particular webinar. So these are some norms. We have them in English and Spanish on the screen. And basically, I'll read them off. And again, we have Spanish interpreters. They'll be reading off the Spanish. So the presentation will be a webinar format. You will not be able to see each other, only the panelists and the facilitator. The panelists will try to answer as many questions as possible. This evening, we have Brittany, who's on the call, and I'm going to go ahead and have her introduce herself in a few minutes. Microphones of all attendees will be muted unless the attendees raise their hand to ask their question live. And I will give you a little bit more information about that in a few minutes. The session is being recorded and will be posted in the district website, but also the YouTube channel. And I provided the website for the school district here as well. So on this screen here, you'll see the two different icons that we will be using this evening. The Q&A, again, is at the very bottom of your screen. If you press on that or click on the Q&A, you'll see where you can go ahead, a box will appear where you can actually write in a statement or a question. You can write it in English or in Spanish. I speak Spanish, so I'll be able to read the question out loud. And also, if there's any additional questions aside from the one that you write in and you prefer to ask your question live, you can press the other icon that's at the very bottom, which again is raise hand. Now, if you don't see this particular icon with the raise hand, but you do see the three dots that say more, you might be maybe joining the Zoom this evening on your phone, and that's probably what you can see, which is the three dots. Once you press the three dots, you'll see the raise hand, okay? And again, in terms of the chat is not available this evening. However, we will be able to, myself, and also Brittany, will be able to put any links and direct you to the chat. You are able to view what is posted there, and we'll provide some guidance on that later. But we do have an evaluation of feedback form that we would like for you to complete at the very end of our session here. So please do not leave. At some point, once Brittany is done answering questions, she will leave the session, but we will continue with the feedback form, as I mentioned earlier, and again, answer any questions that you might have. So be on the lookout for the chat, but we'll direct you also to view the chat when we post information. And so for what we'll do is that we will raffle off these items. We have two $10 gift cards of Walmart. That's a total of $20 for one family, the first winner. Then we also have 4-pack of Roger Williams Park Zoo for free admission tickets. And so that's also for the third prize. So again, we have 3 different prizes. And once we're, at the end of the session, we like to go through this very quickly. So then that way you can go ahead and enjoy the rest of the evening. Okay, So that ends my norms here. So I will go ahead and introduce Brittany. Brittany, you're muted. If you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. So go ahead, Brittany. You can introduce yourself and we will move forward. Just a quick reminder, Brittany. Again, we do have interpreters, so then that way you can go ahead and do your presentation. But if you can just try to keep to a nice pace, so that way they can come up with you as well.
Perfect.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Hoffman. I am the manager of youth programming and education at Planned Parenthood of Southern New England. I'm based out of Providence, Rhode Island, but Planned Parenthood of Southern New England is a two-state affiliate. So that is Connecticut and Rhode Island. And we have just about 15 health centers between our two states. I have been educating folks at Planned Parenthood about sexuality since 2016. I started as an intern. I really fell in love with working at Planned Parenthood. And so I became a youth development specialist where I worked primarily with high school youth, but also did work with elementary school and middle school youth, as well as college young people. And a couple of years ago, I transitioned to my role as a manager, where now I do a lot more work with professionals, so doing professional development trainings, and a lot of work with parents. I really enjoy working with parents and talking to them about how to talk with the young people in their lives about sexuality and education. And so I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all about that. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. Perfect. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So I'm hoping most of y'all are parents and supportive adults, and we are going to be talking about how to have conversations, shame-free conversations about sexuality. Just to get us started, I want to share a little bit about Planned Parenthood. So like I said, we're a two-state affiliate. We have one health center in Providence, Rhode Island, and we have 14 health centers in Connecticut. We offer reproductive health care services out of our health centers. So some of those services might include birth control, STI testing, pregnancy testing, cancer screenings. We also perform abortions and do adoption referrals. And something that's not on here is we actually do gender affirming hormone therapy care. To access services at Planned Parenthood, you do not need insurance. You actually can come in with insurance, you can come in without insurance. We have a sliding fee scale, which means that if someone needs a service and they need help paying for that, that does slide. So we offer a sliding fee scale. Planned Parenthood's motto, though, is care no matter what. And what that means is that at Planned Parenthood, we believe that people deserve access to reproductive health care services, regardless of whether or not they can afford those services, right? So at Planned Parenthood, our care no matter what means that if you need a service and you cannot afford to pay for that service, we are still going to offer that service to you. We have worked with some amazing community partners in Rhode Island that help us to fund services that folks can't afford, as well as we have our own funding and we do payment plans. So when we say care no matter what, we mean that people can access those services no matter what. We do offer walk-in and online appointment scheduling, and I'm really proud of the educational programming that we offer to teens. So we have a program called Students Teaching About Responsible Sexuality, and they are paid positions where young high school youth are paid to come to Planned Parenthood to learn about healthy sexuality, how to be safe and healthy when it comes to sexuality and sexual activity. And so they get trained on those topics, and their job essentially is just to go out and educate their peers, their friends, anyone that they come into contact with about what healthy sexuality is. And so it's a really cool program for young people. We also, part of that program is our STARS put on teen nights. And teen nights are educational programs that are for teenagers only. They get to come to workshops and learn about different health and sexuality topics. So we actually have one next week on May 16th. The STARS peer educators are going to be talking about mental health and sexuality. And so these workshops are led by young people. So they are led by our STARS. And so you can find out more information about both of those programs at ppsme.org and then /youth. And that will pop up with all of this programming. And if anyone has any questions about Planned Parenthood, feel free to throw that into the question and answer.
Brittany, when you have a chance, can you repeat the website that you just mentioned? I'll go ahead and post it on the chat for you.
Yes, and I will have all of the, if I talk about resources and websites, I will have all of those in the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Too. And we share that, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes. And so the website that I had mentioned was ppsne.org/stars. And that'll bring you to our STARS page, which also can help you to find the youth programming page.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you. All right. We will keep, oh, we got it. Perfect. All right. So what we are going to talk about. So I apologize, it says name, but I would love to know who is here with us today. So we're going to do a poll question. I would love to know what are the ages of the young people that are in your lives, your children, the young people that you care for. What ages are there? So we have a couple of folks with elementary school youth, middle school youth, and high school youth. So we got a good spread. It's really spread out. So yeah, we're going to talk about, today we're going to talk about what is the role of caregivers and sexuality educators. We're going to do a little bit of a reflection activity where you're going to reflect on your experiences learning about sexuality. And then we're going to do some practice of how to answer questions. We can't practice them together, but I am going to encourage you to practice them when you get the PowerPoint presentation. It's just a little preview of what we're going to talk about today. Okay. So at Planned Parenthood, we believe that parents and trusted adults and caregivers are the primary sexuality educators. And I know some folks might be like, no, I'm not, right? But without knowing, many of us are sending messages about sexuality from the moment someone is born. And to explain this a little further, we're going to take a look at something called the circles of sexuality. So these are the circles of sexuality. There's sensuality, intimacy, sexual identity, sexual health and reproduction, and sexualization. So we're going to start on this bottom one that says sexual health and reproduction. And the reason I want to start there is because when we talk about sexuality, this is what most people think of, right? They think of sexual behavior, STIs, anatomy, contraception, pregnancy, right? So sexual health and reproduction is it's a person's capacity to reproduce and the behaviors and attitudes that make sexual relationships, right? So when we're talking about this, a lot of times this is the focus, right? On what sexual activities are, what the consequences or outcomes of those sexual activities can be, right? But sexuality is so much more than those circles, right? So then we also have sexual identity. And sexual identity is a person's understanding of who they are sexually, including the sense of being male, of being female, or maybe another gender, right? Sexual identity consists of 3 interlocking pieces that together affect how each person sees themselves. And each of those pieces is important, right? So when we're talking about sexual identity, we're primarily talking about gender identity, sexual orientation. We're also talking about sex assigned at birth. We're talking about gender roles, right? And so thinking about when I had mentioned that we are many times we are sending messages about sexuality from the moment we're born, right? Children, they see those gender roles, right? They see the differences between gender. They see the different mannerisms and how people act and maybe what they do, right? And from household to household and culture to culture, those things can look different, right? But that is something that happens really young. We are setting those expectations many times for what gender looks like in our home, right? And then we have intimacy. And intimacy is the ability to be emotionally close to another human being and to accept closeness in return. So some examples of intimacy is caring for yourself or caring for someone else. It's sharing, right? Loving, liking, vulnerability, and trust. And these are things that are formed in those formative years as a child, right? So many times we're looking at this, and young people's first experience with this is when they're toddlers or babies, right? They learn to trust their caregivers. They enjoy being nurtured and cared for by their caregivers, right? So this intimacy starts really early on in life. And then we have sensuality. And sensuality is the awareness and feeling about your own body and the bodies of other people, especially the body of someone who might be a sexual partner. Sensuality enables us to feel good about how our bodies look and feel and what they can do. Sensuality also allows us to enjoy the pleasure our bodies can give us and others. And this part of sexuality affects our behavior in a lot of ways, right? And so many times when we're talking about sensuality, and again, talking about how sexuality starts really young in life, we talk about skin hunger. And if you're not familiar, skin hunger is the need to be touched and held by others in loving and caring ways. And I love to use this example that when a baby is born, the birthing parent, many times they immediately take that baby that's born and put it on the birthing parent's chest, right? And this skin to skin contact is so important for newborns to get that skin to skin contact to help build that trust, that bonding, right? And skin hunger is with us from the time we're born, right? We innately want to experience skin hunger. And so that's just another example of how sexuality is really lifelong. It starts really young, and young people, they learn it. So other examples of sensuality include sight, sound, so those senses that we have. It can include sexual response cycles, so how someone responds to their sexual feelings and needs. It also includes body image and how a person views their own body, how they, the way that they view their body, as well as fantasy, right? So those things that folks want to do, those wants, those needs. And then lastly, we have sexualization. And this is an aspect of sexuality that people behave sexually to influence, manipulate, or control other people. This can be called the shadowy side of human sexuality. And this spans behaviors that range from relatively harmless things to things that might be violent or cruel. These behaviors, like I said, can include like flirting, right? So very mild behavior. The way that the media, right? When we talk about sexualization, many times folks recognize the media in its role of sexualization. There's also messaging, so media messaging, sorry. There's seduction, and there's also sexual harassment and sexual violence that come into sexualization. Teens need to know that no one has the right to exploit them sexually, and that they do not have the right to exploit anyone else sexually. So just to kind of bring this back to why we believe parents are the primary sex educators, is those messages around sexuality start young. They're learning about gender, they're learning about their bodies, they're learning about what's okay, what's not okay. And as parents and caregivers, you are the first people that they learn from. And so that's why at Planned Parenthood, we really truly believe that parents are primary sex educators when it comes to sexuality with young people. Okay. So we're going to do another poll. I would love to know from you all, what's the reason that you want to talk about your child or young person about sexuality? Why do you think it's important? What is the value in that? Why do you want to do it? Is it because you want to be the one they learn from, to keep others from being first? Is it to instill your family values, what you believe, your expectations? Is it to protect them from health outcomes like STIs or pregnancies, or to help them avoid abusive or unhealthy relationships? Or do you just really, this is my role as a parent. So what do you all think? Why why are you interested in talking to them about this? Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So a lot of folks saying to protect them, right? Yeah, that's a natural need, right? Parents many times are those protectors, and we want to make sure we protect young people from those things that we want to make sure that if they're choosing, right, they're choosing because they want to, right? So it may be to protect them from STIs, it may be to protect them from unplanned pregnancies or unintended pregnancies. It might be to protect them in their relationships, right? So yeah, that level of protection. And then a lot of people also said it's your role as a parent. That's really cool to hear. Many times parents, want to have these conversations with their young people, but they don't always know how, right? And so that's really, I'm glad to see this. For the first one, so I'm the one they learn from, right? We know young people are getting messages about sexuality, whether it be from TV, music, their peers, the internet, right? They're getting a lot of those messages. And many times people want to protect them so that they know that their young people are getting good information, right? And the other thing is with instill your family values, right? So as we mentioned, as you all are the primary sex educators, that also means you get to talk about your values in your family, right? And those values can look different person to person. But what's really important and really distinct, right, is that, as a parent and caregiver, you get to talk about your values and what you believe. Whereas educators, our role is just to give the information, right? So we're giving the information so that young people have it. You get to do that little extra thing where you get to also talk about what you value when it comes to sex and sexuality. And then for our last poll, what worries you about having these conversations? What worries you about talking about sexuality with those young people? So we're going to do one more poll. Are you worried about not having the answers? Are you worried about your young person misinterpreting you and talking about this means that you're giving permission? Are you worried about being ignored, or are you worried about it being embarrassing or awkward? Yes, awesome. So a lot of folks saying that they are worried about not having all the answers. And I have good news for you. That is okay. We'll talk about it in a bit, but it is okay to not have all the answers. And some folks saying it's embarrassing or awkward, right? And that's totally normal, right? These conversations can be awkward and embarrassing. But what's really interesting is that when we look at data, the more parents and teens talk about this, the easier it gets, right? And so there is hope that, if it's awkward at first, it doesn't mean it's always going to be awkward, right? And like I said, we have great news about not having all the answers. It's totally okay. So, when it comes to data, parents and teens both want to talk, right? Parents and teens both want to have these conversations. So 61% of parents want their child to wait until they're ready, or different levels of waiting till they are ready to have sex, right? But so 61% want to talk about it, want their children to wait, but only about half have even had that conversation, right? And so in order for young people to know what folks' values are or expectations around this as parents and caregivers, we have to have that conversation, right? And when it comes to teens, 38% of teens said that caregivers are the biggest influence on their decision to have sex, right? So as parents and caregivers, that one about being ignored, teens actually say that they care about what their caregivers think when it comes to these topics, and they want to talk about it. 87% of teens said it would be easier to delay sex and avoid pregnancy if they could have more open conversations with their caregivers. And I think it's really important to note that, we think that young people don't want to have these conversations, yet the data really shows that they do want to have these conversations specifically with their parents and caregivers. Data also shows us that teens who talk to their parents and caregivers about sex are more likely to wait longer and be safer when they do. So they're more likely to delay sex and so not be sexually active, and they're more likely to use condoms or birth control methods when they do become sexually active, if they have those conversations with their parents and caregivers.
Brittany, I just want to remind folks, if anyone has any questions or any statement of what you're hearing, listening, learning,
Yes.
please go ahead and make sure to press, to click on Q&A and write your question there or a statement.
Yes.
And you can also raise your hand. So again, if you prefer to ask your question live, go ahead and click on raise hand at the very bottom of your screen. We'll be able to see the raise hand and call your name out based on what it appears right now on your video. And then we'll ask you to unmute. So as Brittany continues with her presentation, please keep that in mind.
Yes, please. And if you have a question, there's a great chance that somebody else has that same question, right? And so, there's no such thing as dumb questions. I know you've probably heard that before, but I truly mean it. And like I said, many times when people ask questions, there was someone else who also had that question. So please feel free to comment, ask questions, anything like that. Yes. Keep going. So like I said, parents and teens, they want to have these conversations. Teens want to have these conversations with their parents and caregivers. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that in just a minute. And so the other thing is like parents and caregivers want to have this conversation, and it's really important, right? So the average age of when teens first have sex is 17 years old. We're almost close to 18 at this point, but that is the average age of when teens first had sex. Most children have had a conversation about sex with a peer by the age of 8 years old, right? So most children have already had a sexuality conversation with their peer or their friend by the time they're 8 years old. And you may seem young, but there is a lot of conversations. Peers learn from each other, right? And so it's many times that happens. And the other thing is that most children have viewed porn, often accidentally, by the time they are 11 years old. And that is pretty young, right? And that statistic has gotten younger and younger as the years have gone on. And when I say often accidentally, many times young people are exposed to porn for the first time because they're actually Googling about their bodies, right? So they might be Googling about why does my penis do this or something like that. And then porn pops up, right? And so it's really helpful that young people also know how to access information when it comes to sexuality so that they know where those reputable places are. And I show these things so that folks can see that like these conversations need to happen earlier, right? I think a lot of times when we talking about sexuality with young people, there's a focus on pregnancy and STIs. And so like there's a focus on like having those conversations in high school, right? But like we're seeing here, even in elementary school and middle school, young people are starting to have those conversations about sexuality and learning about sexuality. And we're going to talk a little bit about this after, but there are things that you can talk about with elementary school and middle school about sexuality. And we're going to look at that in a few minutes, but those conversations can come up, right? If we're talking about like, where do babies come from, right? Or talking about puberty, things like that, where those conversations are earlier on. Any questions? We're going to do a little reflective activity in just a second, but I want to know if anyone has any questions about what we have talked about so far. No worries. Awesome. So we're going to do a little reflective activity. So now that we've kind of talked about why it's important to have these conversations and talked about, that teens and young people really do want to have this conversation, it's really important to spend some time thinking about you and how you learned about sexuality, right? Sometimes we have some baggage or some, preconceived ideas or things that we need to unpack and examine to make sure that we aren't, placing our issues and our concerns on our children, right? So it can be really helpful for us to reflect and think about how did we learn about sexuality? So we're going to take a journey back to your earlier years to help you remember and examine how you learned about sexuality and figure out what you want to be similar or different for your children. You know, please keep in mind that families look different to different people, right? Foster children might not have traditional family structures. Many people might have sad or painful memories about their early years in their families. And if you have painful memories that you don't want to revisit, you know, feel free to let your mind wander to another topic. If you want to grab some water, you know, you do not have, this is a optional activity, but it's really helpful for us to kind of ground ourselves in, you know, what did we learn? What do we want to be the same? And what do we want to be different? So I'm going to have you sit comfortably in your chair. And if you'd like, you can close your eyes. And I'm going to read this prompt for you to reflect. So think back as far as you can remember to when you were a young child. Try to envision your childhood home. Think about your bedroom or wherever you slept. Picture the family members who lived with you. Did you live with sisters and brothers, parents, cousins, grandparents, any other relatives, or even some folks who might live with close friends, foster parents, or extended family? So picture those faces of the people that you lived with. How did your family get along? How did they communicate? How did they work out their differences and argue? How much affection was shown in your home and how was it shown? How did people show each other that they loved each other? When you were very young, what names were you taught for the sexual parts of your body, such as your vulva, your vagina, breasts, penis, or testicles? What names of those body parts? What were some of the feelings or attitudes that you developed about those body parts? For example, were they good, bad, clean, dirty? Were they a secret? Or was it okay to talk about those body parts? When, if ever, did your parents or guardians first speak directly to you about sexuality? What age were you? And what did they talk about with you? If they did have those conversations, did you ask questions? Were you able to talk to your parents about sexuality? At any point in your childhood, did you learn about the changes you would experience during puberty? Did you learn about dating or being attracted to someone? Did you learn when it was the right age to engage in sexual behavior? Did you learn about attractions between the same members of the same sex? Did you learn about pleasure? Did you learn about sexual responsibility, like preventing unintended pregnancies or avoiding sexually transmitted infections? Did they talk to you about marriage and or committed relationships or love? So I want you to think about, what did they say to you? What did you think? And now you can return back to, now as an adult. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Normally we'd have this as a group discussion, but I would love for you just to reflect. If you had to sum up in a few words or a phrase, what's the primary message your parents and caregivers gave you about sexuality? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it shameful? Was it taboo? Did your parents talk to you about it at all? Were you given a book? How did you learn about sexuality? And how was that? What were the primary messages? And then I want you to thinking about your experiences and the way that you grew up understanding and learning about sexuality. How do you want your young people's experiences to be similar or different from your own? Are there certain parts that you want to continue? Are there certain parts you're like, I don't want to do this to my young person? And maybe what are the new things? What are the things you want to break? And are people able to unmute and just share what they, like if they had to sum it up? I don't know if folks want to share.
Yeah, they cannot unmute themselves. So again, anyone that's on the call, if you are interested in sharing and not in sharing out loud and not write your statement or response, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to say it out loud so others can hear.
Awesome. If anyone would like to share, if you can sum it up in a word or two or a few words, what was the primary messages your parents gave you about sexuality? And I'll give it maybe I'll give it like a minute if folks want to share. I would love to hear from you.
I'll start.
Okay.
I'll turn on my video.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm thinking that trying to remember, and thank you for coming up with all those questions, watching this car ride. I think that it was a taboo. It was not a comfortable conversation. It wasn't even a conversation. It was more a
one-way street.
Yeah, pretty much. Or short phrases. Don't let anyone touch you. The topic of menstruation was something that probably made it easier to talk a little bit about it.
Yep.
But even just, your question, so where did you first learn about sexuality or anything like that? And I could say that it was most likely in our health class. Yeah. Again, where menstruation was being discussed. And I think that is kind of like a easy way to talk about it, especially to discuss the differences between the genders, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's super common. I hear that a lot it's not a conversation. It was basically, I'm telling you this, and that it's not up for debate or discussion, right? Yeah, exactly. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it.
Of course. I hope somebody else is motivated. Please share.
I can share too my own little, and I don't usually, but I can share mine. My mom was pretty open about having these conversations, but my mom never got those conversations when she was younger. She had a very different experience, almost no conversation. She actually got her period and did not know what was happening. And so, she really wanted to make sure that I had a different experience, but my mom was working with limited knowledge, right? And so sometimes she gave me not accurate information, but she was doing the best she could, right? And I know that even as a teen, I knew that. But I had a very different experience, where my mom was pretty open about it. But my peers, that was another story. Like many of my peers never, ever, ever talked to their parents about it. And if they did, it was like you mentioned, where it was not a conversation. It was a one-way street. And it was really, I know you said don't, right? Don't do this, don't do that, right? Instead of having that more open conversation and dialogue. So yeah, thanks for sharing. Does anybody else want to share? You can just say a word or two. Like, how would you sum up the messages you got about sexuality from your parents? You're muted.
Everyone is shy, Brittany.
That's okay. We can keep going. If you want to interrupt me, feel free to interrupt me. That is okay. So understanding the impact, right? So parents and trusted adults, you want to help young people, right? You all have the best intentions for your young people to help protect them and keep them safe. And many times, that is motivated in avoiding those negative sexual consequences. And I say negative because for someone else, it might not be negative. It just has a tendency to be viewed negative. And so sometimes this may lead to unintentional messages that are negative or inaccurate about sex and sexuality, right? So sometimes we can send those negative messages of sexuality is taboo, right? We're not supposed to talk about it. We're not, it is for a private place only. And it shouldn't be something that we're openly and comfortable talking about, right? But when we send that message, right, how do we talk about relationships and consent, right? Relationships and consent involves talking about sexuality, right? It talks about creating sexual boundaries, talking about, what and if someone wants to have sex, right? So we're sending this message that we shouldn't talk about sexuality. We're also setting a message for that as well, right? We also may unintentionally communicate that like body parts are gross or nasty or things like that, right? Or dirty, right? Whereas body parts are just body parts. They're no different than your arm, your eyes, right? Your mouth. Those sexual body parts are private, right? But that doesn't mean that we need to talk about them in such a negative way. Another thing we talk about too is actually using correct names for our body parts, right? So, using words like penis or vagina or vulva or testicles or breasts, right? And the reason why we talk about that is because young people, when we are using different words, that can send a message. But also when we're talking about operating in healthcare, right? So everyone at some point is going to need to access healthcare services. And many times people need to access reproductive healthcare services. And so if someone is talking to a doctor, they want to be able to accurately describe what symptoms they may be having or where on those body parts, right? And so, having young people and people know the correct names for their body parts is really important when it comes to healthcare, right? Some other unintentional messages that we might send is who can have sex, right? And so many times, especially for people who present female or identify as female, there's really different expectations for them when it comes to sex, right? They might be the ones who are expected to not have sex or to be the gatekeeper, right? They might also be the ones who are expected to be solely responsible for pregnancy and STI prevention, right? And so many times we send a message to folks that may identify as female that being sexual is bad and that they shouldn't, right? And the other message that can come with that too is that people who identify as male are, overtly sexual or can't control their sexuality, right? And those messages have an impact in our cultures, right? So when we are, again, when we're having these conversations, it's really important to try and, figure out what are you trying to say? What message do you want to send to your young person? Do you want to send a message that, it's okay to talk about sexuality? There is a time and place to talk about sexuality. Or do we want to send messages that can, result in those unintended consequences unintentional, right? So we want to make sure that, we talked about this, having those shame-free conversations, right? Having those shame-free conversations makes it more likely that your young person is going to learn. It makes it more likely that they're going to seek you out for help or advice, right? And it makes it more likely for young people to actually delay sex or to use things to prevent pregnancies or STIs if they become sexually active. And so many times we get questions around, okay, I want to have these conversations about sexuality with my young person, but I don't know what is appropriate and what's not appropriate, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the stages of sexual development. So we're going to break it down into 4 different age groups. So the first age group is birth to 4 years old, right? And so children at this age, they might explore their body parts. They might learn what's expected from gender roles or norms. They might become very aware or curious about gender and body differences, right? So they might notice that their body parts are different from someone else's body parts. They may start to play house or doctor or explore other forms of play with their friends and siblings. They may establish a sense of their own gender, right? So research has shown us that young people typically know their age, young people typically know their gender identity by the time they're 4 years old, right? And that's not all people, that's just some people. But so they might establish that sense of their own gender. They also might copy adult sexual behaviors, right? Thinking of hugging and kissing, right? And they might be curious of their origins. Those, where did baby come from? Where did I come from, right? So in this age group, you can talk about the different sexual body parts that they have. You can name, this is a penis, this is a vagina, this is a vulva, right? You can use those body types. You can talk to them about gender norms, right? Really, really young people really develop, those ideas of what gender roles and norms. If you look at studies, young kids will even pick toys based on their gender, right? And those are those perceived ideas of what is gender norms, right? So you can talk to them about gender. You can talk to them about, the norms and roles that come up and what ones you want them to know about. And then you can also teach them about privacy at this age, what is private, what's not private, and talk about those expectations around those things. And then we're going to go into school age. So this is, the K through 5th grade, 5 to 9-year-olds, right? And so children at this age might be very curious about pregnancy and birth. They might want to know where do babies come from? How do babies get out of a belly? They might be curious about how pregnancies happen, right? And so at this age, they're really curious about that. And it's okay to talk to them about what pregnancies are, how they happen, all of that. At this age, for the school age, they start to develop strong same-sex friendships, right? Children of another gender sometimes are seen as gross or icky, right? That is very gender roles, right? I will say that it's based on gender roles and norms that can be different from young person to young person. But this is the years where they really start to develop those friendships. They also begin to focus on peer group style of dress and speech, right? So they might start to identify what they like, what they dislike, how they're going to talk. And they might discover their sexual orientation. And this doesn't mean that a child is acting on it, but sometimes this is where you can see those little elementary school crushes, right? Puppy love, sometimes folks call it, right? And so sometimes that's happened. So at this age, it's really great to talk about relationships and friendships and consent. Talking about what does it mean to be a good friend? How do people show each other respect, right? It can also be a great time to talk about consent, right? So giving permission to get a hug, or talking about what body parts are private, what body parts shouldn't be touched by others, or what body parts can only be touched by that young person, and starting to have those conversations about that. And also, folks, you can also start having deeper conversations around gender identity and sexual orientation at this age as well. And then preteens, so this is that 9 to 12-year-old age mark, right? So at this age, folks might begin to start to begin puberty, including menstruation and wet dreams. So they may start to get their period, and they may start to experience erections if they have a penis. And it's important to note that that is not always sexual. Like when they are in this age range, especially people with penises, they don't always have control. An erection might not be sexual. It just is the body's response, right? And so it's preteens in this age group. They also might become more modest and private, right? They might not want, folks to see them without their clothing on. They might want the door closed, things like that. So they might be desire more privacy at this age. Along with puberty, sometimes those mood swings come, right? Where when young people are going through puberty, there's an influx of new hormones that have not been felt at different levels. And so those mood swings can happen. And it's not in their control, right? It's one of those things that kind of it's out of their control. Preteens might start to feel awkward and wonder, am I normal, right? Is this normal? Am I normal? They might start to develop romantic crushes on friends, older teens, celebrities, or even sometimes folks who care for them like teachers or counselors. They may start to question whether they are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. And this is the age where they are strongly influenced by their peers, but parents remain the main source of their values. So they're still at that age where they can talk to their parents. And so at this age level, some things you can talk about puberty, right? The experiences that puberty comes. You can talk about gender and sexuality. You can start to have conversations about sex and abstinence, romantic and healthy relationships, all of that. So this is a really time where those conversations are really important because you want them to happen before they meet them, right? I talk about this a lot that sex education is like driver's ed school, right? You want to learn how to drive before you drive a car. And the same can be said for sexuality. We want young people to know about healthy relationships before they have a relationship. We want them to know about the outcomes of pregnancy and how to protect themselves before they're sexually active, right? So having these conversations beforehand helps to prepare them for when they need that information. So a lot of times in this preteen age time is where a lot of those conversations about sexuality are going to be happening. And then we have teens, right? And so teens might look for ways to express their identity through their clothes, their behaviors, the activities they do. They might participate in risk behaviors and take in experimentation, right? So they might experiment in, drinking or drugs and alcohol, or even sometimes the experimentation is just breaking the rules, right? Staying out later or hanging out alone in a friend's house, right? They might face those decisions around sex and drugs at this age because of that, right? So this is where those things may be the first time they're offered, or where a teen would have access to those. And so they face the decision about that. They may initiate sexual activity and become involved in a serious relationship. They could also come out if they are queer, regardless of sexual behavior or experience. And they might start to take on more adult roles and responsibilities while still developing both physically and emotionally. And so when we're talking in this age group, right, many times teens have already had some of these conversations, but this is where we get to reinforce, where parents and caregivers, you get to kind of reinforce those values and expectations that you have of young people that you've already had those conversations about, hopefully, right? So reinforcing what beliefs you have or things you expect. Any questions about the ages and the stages, like what age is okay to talk about what? Any questions about the ages and stages when it comes to having these conversations? So we're going to talk about now answering those questions, right? So some tips for that, right? So first, take a breath. It is okay to need a minute, right? Sometimes young people, when they ask these questions, they might catch us off guard, right? We may not be expecting the question. And it's okay to say that you need a second, or to say, you know what, I need a minute to think about that. So, take a second, take a breath. It's okay. And, sometimes even just saying, I know folks had said, they're worried about it being awkward or embarrassing, right? Sometimes naming that with your young person is really helpful. It can help them to feel validated in the way they feel. It can make it more likely for them to have that open conversation if they know that they're not the only ones who are uncomfortable, right? So this is a good place to take a breath, take a minute if you need to, just own how you're feeling, right? When you get that question, it can really helpful to think about and determine, what do they already know about that, right? What background information do they have? What conversations might you have already had about this topic, right? And then the other thing is finding the meaning behind the question, right? So sometimes a young person asks a question and we might need to read between the lines a little bit. It might not be clear what the question is, or we might need to, figure out what that question really is. And the next step is to give a brief, age-appropriate answer, right? And we say brief because less is sometimes more, right? Sometimes, a young person might be like, what's an erection? And we want to go into explaining every detail of what it is, how it happens, all of that. When a young person might really just it's when the penis gets hard, right? Simple, fast, to the point, and brief, right? And that's where that age appropriate comes in, right? We don't need to go really into detail many times when it comes to younger people when they are asking these questions. So less is sometimes more when it comes to answering these questions. And then if you don't know the answer, that is okay. I had talked about, I've been teaching sexuality education for 6 years, and I can still tell you that I get stumped from time to time, right? There are those times where I have a really hard time answering a question, or I just don't know the answer, right? And so if you don't know the answer, you can say it. You can say to that young person, you know what, I don't know the answer to this, but let's go find the answer together. Let's go look online. Or, I don't know the answer to this. Is it okay if I get back to you tomorrow or a few days, right? So letting them know that you don't know the answer, but you'll get back to them. I will say, if there's a question that really catches you off guard, you just don't know how to answer it. Maybe you know the answer, but you don't know how to answer it. You can say that then too, right? I need a minute. Is it okay if I bring this up with you tomorrow? Is this okay? We loop back to this next week, right? So give yourself time to find the answer. And this is the really important part. If you say that you're going to come back and answer it later, come back and answer it later, right? Don't ghost your kids. Don't say that you're going to give them the answer and then never get back to them, right? It's really important that, young people do get the information that they need from us when they ask us, because that's when they get to come back, right? And so the last part is to check they understand and keep the door open, right? So you're going, So, does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Do you have any more questions, right? So making sure they understand and then keeping the door open. It can be really simple of like, thank you for coming to me with that question. Thanks for feeling brave enough to talk about this. If you ever have questions again, please feel free to come to me with those questions, right? So keeping the door open so that they feel comfortable coming to you with those questions. Any questions about any questions about this?
Brittany.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could share in your experience, are there specific a specific time or place where you have heard that youth, felt comfortable? Because it's always good to learn based on what they've said, what they've shared. That would provide some guidance for folks that are on the call.
Yeah. So we call this the anything but, and that's such a great question because it's the anything but. So please do anything over. Okay, we're going to have the talk. Anything but that is what young people want. They don't want, to be bombarded with this ton of information all at once. Okay, we're going to have to talk and we're going to talk about everything all at once, right? What young people really ask for is for it to be spread out, right? So to talk about it spread out over time. And then something we kind of came up with based on feedback from young people is teachable moments. And we're going to actually watch a video about it in a minute. But what teachable moments are is those opportunities that come up where you're like, oh, I can talk about this right here, right? So like, as an example, I'm not going to share the one that's in the video, but as an example, if you were driving down the road and let's say WAP by Cardi came on, great example, right? And you could use that as a teachable moment, right? Of being like, wow, this is a really interesting song. Did you know that vaginas they have it's normal for vaginas to have discharge, right? So Cardi talking about this, she's actually educating folks that it's normal for vaginas to be like that, right? So we talk about teachable moments of when these opportunities present themselves to talk about these topics, using them as teachable moments rather than, we're going to have the birds and bees conversation, or we're going to talk about everything to do with puberty and menstruation in 30 minutes, right? Teens, they really want to have those conversations, but they do not want to have a one and done conversation, and they don't want to be overwhelmed with information. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I think that it's not realistic to be able to talk about everything all at the same time, even though you probably say it, but you probably won't get that far, just because it's probably that uncomfortable. Yeah. Or you probably catch yourself and you're wondering, you know what, we can probably hold that conversation for another day.
Exactly. And I think what you said too, just like jogged my memory, right? Of that, when it's that one and done, young people don't feel comfortable coming back, right? When we send that message of like, we're going to talk about all this right now, and then it's never going to happen again, right? Whereas if we're spreading out those conversations, it also gets less awkward. It gets less embarrassing. It feels more normal, right? So creating a culture in your household or a norm in your household that it is okay and normal to talk about our bodies and relationships, like that makes it more likely that when they need to have those conversations, they're going to come to you, right?
Would you agree that one really good tip is just make sure that you end that short conversation with what you have here on the screen at the very bottom?
Yes, yes.
That it is open. We're not going to finish right now, but we definitely, anytime you feel like wanting to talk about it, just let me know. We'll just make sure to make some time. Hopefully it's appropriate. It's an appropriate time, but we'll figure that out.
Exactly. And that's the thing too, like time and place is a thing, right? There is a time and there is a place. And you could tell your young people that, like, they ask in the middle of the supermarket, like, why does my penis get hard? Maybe not the time and place, right? And you can say that, like, thank you for asking that question. We're not going to talk about it right now, but when we get home, we can, right? And yes, so that is perfect. And I think that last one is just so important, right? To keep that door open, right? If your young person asks you a question and you gave them the answer and they are like, wow, I can ask my parent this question, and that door is still open, they're going to come back and ask more questions, right? Having these open conversations allows young people to be open and honest with their caregivers, right? Which is what we want. We want them to have these conversations. We want the young people in our lives to be able to come to us for help and advice and perspectives, right? And when we keep that door open, that's what allows them to come forward and to continue to talk to us about those things, right? Whereas if someone asks something and we're like, we don't talk about that, you're too young for this, we're not talking about it, right? That door feels closed. And for a young person, that might send a message of, oh, I can't talk to my caregiver about this topic, right? And, that's why that breathe is so important, right? Taking that breath and being like, okay, like this is it. And again, you don't have to answer it right now. Time and place is a thing. And you could say, you know what, I really want to talk about this, but now is not the best time. Can we talk about it tomorrow? So, giving yourself grace and understanding that, this might be a new experience and might, your feelings are valid. It might feel really uncomfortable and embarrassing and scary. But it is also important to have these conversations. So yeah, thank you. All right. So we're going to watch this video now. And this is actually one of the resources I'm going to share with you all. But this is a videos for parents, and it directly talks about how to talk about some of those concerns, right? So like how to talk to your kids about gender. How do I talk to my kid about where babies come from? How do I talk to my preteen about porn? How do I talk to my preteen about sex, right? So it has some really great videos. So if you're like, I need to talk about this, but I have no idea how, these are some really great videos to watch. And we're going to watch one right now that focuses on how to talk to your teens about when it's okay to have sex, right? And this is, again, based in your beliefs and values. And so I'm going to play this video. I'm going to share my sound so that everyone can hear, and I'm going to mute myself. But if you could just give me a thumbs up to make sure everyone can hear.
Totally natural for teens to think about sex. In fact, 7 out of 10 teens have sexual intercourse by the age of 19. But we can help our teens wait until they're ready by talking with them. Here are a few tips. Be clear about your feelings and expectations on when you think it's okay to have sex. Listen to your teen's point of view. Talk about the pressure your teen might be feeling. Discuss specific strategies for saying no. Okay, let me show you what this might look like. Let's say you're watching a movie with your son when a steamy scene shows up. You could say something like, "Wow, that couple got physical really quick. What do you think?" "Yeah, way too fast. He hadn't even met our parents yet. You know, I wouldn't go for that." But just curious, when do you think it's okay for people to start having sex? Really? Listen, it may seem like everybody's doing it, but in reality, they're not. The average age people first have sexual intercourse is 17. It's perfectly normal to wait until you're older. As you know, I want you to wait until you're ready in a healthy relationship and prepared. I know you might feel a lot of pressure to have sexual experiences. What would you say if you're being pressured? Yeah, that's a good way to handle it. I'm impressed with your assertiveness. You know, you can always blame it on me. Tell them I'd be really upset. Another way is to avoid situations where things might get out of hand, like being alone together or drinking, okay? One more thing. Even though I want you to wait, if you seriously start thinking about getting serious, talk to me. I want you to be prepared with birth control and condoms. Promise? See, you can do this. Try it yourself with your own teen. You can make a difference. Text Talk to Teen to 69866 to let us know.
Awesome. I hope you liked that video. And that's one of those examples of those teachable moments, right? So finding those opportunities where you can naturally work these conversations into conversations, right? And a lot of times, like, we talk about music, we talk about movies, TV shows, but it also can be the experiences of young people with their friends, right? You know, hearing about so-and-so is in a relationship, that's a great opportunity for you to talk to your young person about relationships, right? You know, like any kind of those things that happen where you can then be like, you know, one, find out what they think, what they know, right? And then also, you know, setting that expectation, setting that value that you have when it comes to that topic.
I think that, I'm sorry, Brittany.
Oh,
I think and I know we're getting close here to the end, but I think it's important to share, because I also have a teenager. You know, that that probably what makes it easier also in terms of getting into this conversation, because I think the approach is what's the most uncomfortable.
yes.
You want to talk about it, but you just don't know how to start it or initiate
Exactly.
it. And most of the time it's not the parent. Most of the time it's the student
Yeah.
or the youth. But what makes it easier, I find, is also when you have conversations about, you know, so how are your friends doing, especially when you know who they are. So I think making sure that that's happening, that you are asking about how your friends are doing, and not making it awkward, but using that as a way to start the conversation.
Exactly.
And not so much, you know, giving your opinion, but rather, so what do you think about it, right?
Exactly. Exactly. What do you think about it? What do you know about it, right? Because getting those answers helps us to understand our young people better, right? And I think that's such a great point, that like it's important to like be a part of our young people's lives by asking about their friends, their peers. You know, when those situations come up, being able to have those conversations just feels natural if it's happening all the time, right? Exactly. Yeah, and you're so right. It's definitely, the hardest part is definitely like bringing up the conversation, allowing it to happen naturally, and figuring out how to do it if it's not, right? And so, yeah, that's great.
Those videos, I mean, well, at least that one, if the rest of the videos are, as let's say, you know, that they have a good flow, And the examples are provided with a good real life
Example. Yeah.
moment or example. But that one was. So
Yeah,
that was-
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. I'm like, I could picture like 5 movies and 3 TV shows where you could use this, right? And so like having those, yeah, there's some really great videos on this, and these are all in the resources. But those, I love those. And then there's something called Amaze, which also will be in the resources. Amaze has amazing videos on how to have these conversations.
Awesome.
And so someone just asked, where do we find the videos? So those videos are, if you are a fan of YouTube, if you ever go to YouTube, Planned Parenthood actually has its own YouTube channel. And so the way that I found this, they have playlists, but if you're on Planned Parenthood's YouTube channel and you want to find information about birth control, if you actually search in the channel, it'll come right up. But so the way that you can find parent videos is if you just search parent, this first playlist is actually the playlist with all of those videos that I talked about. This will be in the resources. So you will have access to it, but this is like a playlist. And then there's also some other videos. So Planned Parenthood has really great videos. There's also Amaze. And sorry, I'm going to pull up Amaze. And so Amaze is another really amazing organization that creates videos and content specifically for young people. They have a ton of videos for elementary school and middle school, which is amazing. So there's Amaze and Amaze Junior. And again, it has that search function. So if you ever went and typed in parent, it talks about with parents, right? So it brings those things up. And so, like I said, there's Amaze, and then there's Amaze Junior. And this is the one, sorry, it's Amaze Parents. So these are all videos that are specifically for parents. So like how to have conversations about parenting, how to have conversations about periods. So there is a ton of these videos that you can look at, and they really, really are great about giving you a perspective or a way to answer those questions. So I definitely would recommend Amaze Parents, Planned Parenthood. They have some really great resources.
Wow. I'm just wondering, too bad pediatricians don't have.
I know.
Right, because pediatricians stay with our kids right up until.
It's funny. Sometimes I do trainings with pediatricians and, those medical and healthcare providers. But not all of them do it, right? Not all of those folks do it. But they should be able to answer a lot of questions, and hopefully they can point you to those resources too. So just to sum it up, right? So when you're answering questions or talking about sexuality, finding those teachable moments, anything but the birds and the bees, right? So finding those teachable moments, spreading out that information, listen more than you talk, right? I think that your perspective is it Janet? I just want to make sure. Janet's perspective of, that the leading the conversation by finding out what they know and what they think is really important, and it can inform what you need to talk about with your young person. Thinking about what they know, right? Building on those bases, especially if you've had those conversations, figuring out what they know. Thinking about what beliefs or values am I trying to reinforce, right? Making sure that those can come through, because as a caregiver and a parent, you get to do that, right? Am I making assumptions or jumping to conclusions? So this is a really great one to consider, because many times when young people ask sexuality questions, especially teens, parents can jump to the conclusion that they are sexually active, or they're asking this question because it's applying to them, right? And so it's really important to try to not jump to conclusions or assumptions when those questions come up. If a young person asks about birth control, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're on birth control or that they're sexually active, right? They could just be asking you because you're the person they trust to ask, right? And then lastly, think, what message am I sending, right? thinking back to that activity of the journey, like what are those hidden messages that we're sending in those conversations? Are you being shame-free? Are you being judgmental? Are you, making it seem like sex is taboo, right? Trying to think about what message am I sending in this conversation? Right. So this is the end of our time together, and we're pretty much right on time. But these are some of the resources I talked about. Again, you will have access to this PowerPoint, which will have all of these resources available. I also put my email in there. There is a ton of youth programming. We also have parent workshops where you can practice answering questions and have some of that skill building. So we do offer those workshops. So if you're ever interested in learning more, in finding youth programming for your young person, any questions that you have, I am a resource. I would love to talk to folks. I love talking with parents. I kind of shared that. I think it's really fun. And so, my email is there, and I am a resource to you. And this is a great time for questions. What questions do folks have? Or, if you want to share, what's something that you're taking away from today's session?
Okay. So Brittany, thank you so much for joining us this evening. To our families that